We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio's special New Year's edition here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Today we're looking at everything that happened last year, everything that's going into this next year. It's going to be quite the show. Let's get started. Christmas is over and the new year approaches, and what better time to look back over 2023 to figure out what were the biggest political stories of the year. Now, there's nobody better placed to discuss such things than Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Always good to be here, Mark.
So, Tim, for me, this has been one of the most fascinating years in American politics. It's just, I've seen Joe Biden go from, let's call it half strength to lower, but I've seen Donald Trump besieged by 90 plus criminal charges facing him and yet go strength to strength. And I don't understand quite the power interplays that are happening here, but that might not even be the biggest story. Tim, what do you consider the biggest story of 2023?
Well, I think the biggest story of 2023 is 2023 is a year I'm going to call the counterintuitive year in politics, because four times Donald Trump was indicted. It added up to 91 charges. And the counterintuitive part is that you would expect if it was anybody else but Donald Trump, 91 charges, even without any convictions, would ruin them, would end their careers. But with Donald Trump, every time he's been indicted, his numbers have risen. It's almost like some sort of indictment strategy, if such a thing could possibly exist, where Trump was inducing them to indict him so that he could increase his popularity, a sort of phenomenon that only he could understand. It's no question, it's hard to understand still Trump's rise, except when you see it in the context of the business of fairness. And I think the average voter sees fairness coming down to some fundamental things, like not trying to throw your political enemy into prison right before a presidential election, and not trying to kick him off the ballot, which, of course, we saw just recently in Colorado. So it's ironic that in a year where the Democrats have been screaming about the death of democracy and how democracy dies in darkness, that this is, in the words of Jonathan Turley, the most undemocratic opinion he has seen in his entire lengthy career.
Yeah, and that's a long and storied career that he's had. I think the other thing he said was America is a powder keg, and you've got these judges throwing matches at it. I thought that was wonderfully evocative. Yeah, so if we can let's dissect this a bit about how Trump is still managing to go up in the polls on this now. And you said fairness, and I think that's a very important part, because despite what the New York Times or the left-leaning periodicals write about, you know, the American dream was only ever for wealthy white people. That's not why people come to America. You know, all the people who come to America to start their lives and bring their families, they all want a piece of the American dream, and that relies on one thing, doesn't it? That relies on a level playing field, a certain amount of fairness. And if you don't have that, there is no such thing as the American dream, because it's the idea that if I work hard, then I can do better than the person who doesn't work as hard, and I can get what I need. I can get the white picket fence. I can get the nice house in suburbia, you know. And if that doesn't exist, then America's not America. And I think what we're seeing, Tim, and this is just my opinion, but I think it's a visceral, the poll numbers that we're seeing for Trump are a visceral rejection of the idea that the American dream is over. Maybe I'm getting a bit Norman Rockwell around the
No,
season.
no, I don't think so, because the sum total of everything that happened in the last year, and the other huge story of the year, of course, is the Hamas invasion of Israel and the subsequent war. And this could well prove to be Waterloo for Biden, because he's at about 32% approval about how he's handled the war in the general public. And of course, his far left flank,
Mm.
on whom he depends for reelection, is furious. They're not going to compromise. This is an explosive, highly explosive emotional issue. We've seen that with the protests in the streets calling for, essentially, for Israel to be wiped off the map. They can try to cleanse that a little bit, but essentially that's what they're calling for. So that's the other big thing this year. And Biden is facing a strong headwind when it comes to that.
Yeah, it's we've talked about this before, but both of the main political parties operate under the big tent premise, right? And so when it comes to an election, everybody sort of, which of these two big tents am I going to sit under? And it seems that the far left, or those, I don't like to call them far left in this situation, although that is where they have been politically represented on the far left. But people who are, as you say, they're openly, even if they pretend that it's not, the idea of the river to the sea, that's calling for the end of Israel and the Israeli people, and it's in Hamas's charter to destroy all the Jews.
And the thing that's particularly tragic about it is that so many of these uneducated youth have no idea
Uneducated college
about.
kids. Let's make this clear.
Yeah, I think they're either uneducated or so thoroughly indoctrinated in the growing cultural Marxism on American campuses that they have no sense of perspective. When you start to call the Jews oppressors, the people who 6 million of whom by official count died at the hands of Germany during World War II, to call them oppressors is, I mean, it would be laughable if it wasn't so pathetically off target. Now, Mark, to go one point that we were discussing just a touch earlier, I don't think in my entire career I've ever actually quoted Chris Christie, but let me quote him here. After the Colorado ruling, which no matter which way it would ultimately go at the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, was a shot across the bow by the left. And even Chris Christie, who of course has based his entire campaign on taking down Donald Trump, said, I don't want Donald Trump out of the Oval Office because he's off the ballot. I want him out of the Oval Office because people voted against him. And I think it's pretty much that simple. If people don't have a chance to vote, then in so many ways, I think election interference is yet another story from this year on a broader basis when you add up 91 charges, 91 felony charges, together with being booted off the ballot in a state. That, if that doesn't constitute election interference, Mark, which is something, of course, that the left keeps crying about with Trump, but if that doesn't constitute election interference, perhaps you could tell me what does.
I'm not claiming anything on that count there, Tim. I think the definitions speak for themselves. Tim Donner, we'll be right back with you after this short break, looking at what's going to happen in 2024 and the big stories to watch for there. Listeners, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking, free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.